Anytime that you impose anything like that, assumptions on the text, that is eisegesis. Okay, here are some examples of eisegesis regarding Daniel 11. One, assumption of a Christological principle that is found in other contexts. This is the idea of Louis Weir and Hans Larendel, we heard about this morning. The idea that the text must say this because that's an imposition of a theological framework from the outside. I don't believe in a Christological principle. There is a Christological pattern, but the idea of principle implies the idea that it must be applied in every case. And in fact, a pattern is derived inductively, like the day-year pattern, for example. I don't call it a principle anymore, because if it is a principle, then we have to take the millennium in Revelation 20, which is in an apocalyptic text, and we have to say that 1,000 years is really 360,000 years, because the day-year principle has to apply to that, you see. We have to take a case-by-case, passage-by-passage analysis of that. So the question is, does Daniel 11 have the idea that once you get to Christ, then everything after that is symbolic? And there is good evidence that that is not the case. All right, assumptions about apocalyptic genre, overlooking differences in subgenre. We heard earlier today, you have the vision in Daniel chapter 8. That is a symbolic vision. The ram represents Media-Persia. The goat represents Greece, and so on and so forth. That is a symbolic vision. Symbolic vision is one subgenre of the apocalyptic genre. But there is another subgenre. That is interpretation. And there was a good presentation earlier that pointed the difference out, that the interpretations are largely literal. Now, I would say mainly literal because they can include figurative language, but it's not symbolic. Figurative language can be just like in normal speech, overwhelmed like a flood. I mean, that's a simile. That's a figure of speech. It's not literal, right? But it's not symbolic in the same sense. Then we have assumptions regarding meanings of words or expressions based on usage in other contexts, such as reading Egypt in Revelation 11, verse 8, into Daniel 11, 42 to 43. That is something that James Barr would call illegitimate totality transfer. You take the meaning of, that's what he calls it, in his books, The Semantics of Biblical Language, published 1961, where you take the full meaning of a word that can be in any context or another context, and you just read it into this context. We know that that doesn't apply here in Daniel 11, because there it says in Revelation 11, verse 8, Sodom, Egypt, where our Lord was crucified, and it explicitly says this is spiritual. That's kind of an allegorical way to say something that has these qualities, and certainly revolutionary France did. But that is not the genre, the subgenre in Daniel 8. So that does not apply, and reading that in is illegitimate totality transfer, which is eisegesis. Assumptions regarding the literary structure of a text based on structures of other passages. If you look at the structure of another passage and you say, therefore, this one has to have exactly that structure, even if it's an interpretation of the other one, there can be differences, and you can't make assumptions and make a rigid transfer. Assumptions based on premature intertextual comparisons, such as reading features of the Exodus story into Daniel 11 without analyzing Daniel 11 on its own terms first. Legitimate comparisons always involve analyzing each item first before you can legitimately compare them, right? It goes for comparing anything, including comparing people. Okay, so just to say, oh, we're going to study the text, and then jump to Exodus and ignore the text of Daniel 11, that is eisegesis. Assumptions regarding a whole literary unit from patterns in part of it, such as the assumption that the progression of predicted events in all of Daniel 11 must be strictly chronological because most of it is chronological. That is an assumption. We have to recognize that. The assumption that an interpretation of a vision, such as Daniel 11, cannot supplement by introducing a new power that's not already represented in the vision that it interprets, in this case Daniel 11, is an assumption because the new passage can supplement as well as interpreting. And we find in Daniel 7, it supplements chapter 2, chapter 8 supplements, and so on and so forth. And it can keep adding things, so you can't make that assumption. Reading historical events into the text before thoroughly analyzing the text itself. Now, I agree that texts must be understood within their historical context. But when we take a text, a predictive text like Daniel 11 or any other prophecy, and we go by just the English translation or by someone else's interpretation or whatever, and we don't thoroughly analyze the text in the original language for ourselves, and then we assign history, we can start on forks in the road that lead us into wasting a lot of time on dead ends because we're just off target. We're just completely off target because we didn't analyze the text first, and then after you've done all of that. And that's what Ellen White says. We heard it quoted today. You look at all the words and their meanings, and that's a lot. And then we can get a correct interpretation of the text. Reading non-textual factors such as current news or preference for an exegetical outcome. I have a friend who just doesn't want to see, well, more than one friend, doesn't want to see, they just don't want to see certain outcomes in Daniel 11. They will not see that. That is outside their box, and therefore they cannot allow for it, and therefore they manipulate the text to avoid saying that, and that is eisegesis. Okay, the literary unit and genre. The literary unit is consisting of Daniel 11, verse 2 to 12:3. That is one discourse unit. This is a speech of an angel to Daniel. So we have to keep that in mind. There is a narrative introduction in 10:4, which makes it clear that this is an interpretation of the vision, which is in Daniel 8. So now we know what it's about. This discourse unit, this speech, is the third interpretive speech regarding Daniel 8. There's one in Daniel 8, there's one in Daniel 9, and this is the third one that's expanding on those. What vision? No vision in Daniel 9 to 12, but it's in 8, 1 to 14. It's the third interpretation. The apocalyptic subgenre, as I mentioned, of this discourse unit is interpretation, not symbolic vision, and it is one discourse unit. There is absolutely no literary indication in this discourse unit that there is any change from basically literal interpretation to symbolic. There's none at all in the literature itself. No clue to that in verse 23, following verse 22, where you have Christ, or in verse 31, where you go to the papacy. There's absolutely no indication that it's anything other than interpretation, which is basically literal. Same genre. Okay, what are the keys to exegesis of Daniel 11? Look, it can get really complicated, but I believe that we should see it as much more simple. There are two major keys to the exegesis of the text. First, intratextual anchor points in Daniel 11, repeating elements in Daniel 8 to 9. We've heard about those. Additional context helps to identify historical reference and where we are in the roadmap of Daniel 11. The subjects of verbs and antecedents of pronouns is the second thing. We have a continuity of these referring to the same person or power that shows continuation in predicted history. He, him, referring to the same power that's introduced. And then we can have a transition, that's breaking that continuity, and that's a transition to a new power in predicted history. It's really very, very simple. It's just syntactic continuity. That's all. If you put these two together, and then after you do that, within this framework established by the text, you accurately identify historical events to which the text refers. You can come up with something solid. Okay, so let's look at it. Intratextual, that means within the book of Daniel, is intratextual anchor points. And you can see here, verse 20, Media, Persia, Greece, and so on. Right at the beginning, it's all explicit, very easy. Mighty king shall arise. That's the king of Greece. That's Alexander the Great. Okay? Piece of cake. Then it gets more challenging. But we know that when he, Alexander the Great, has risen, his kingdom shall be broken, divided toward the four winds of heaven. Same expression in Daniel 11 as in Daniel 8. Same events, breakup of the Hellenistic empires. Then it says in 11:5, the king of the south shall be strong. And when Alexander's kingdom is divided toward the four winds, that means four directions. Compare Zechariah, where winds are directions. So toward these directions, then the king of the south. That's from one of those directions. We have that continuity. Then, moving on, we have 9:25 and 9:26 and 7. We have the prince Who makes the covenant? That's clearly the Prince of the Covenant in 11:22. And that's Christ. I think we would agree with that. This is an anchor point. We know where we are as we proceed through Daniel 11. Right at the heart of Daniel 11, we have Christ, which is wonderful. Okay, then we have deceit. Same word for deceit in Hebrew. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper. This is the deceit in 8:23. Back in 8:25, where we had that word, that is in the context of the little horn in its papal phase. So we know that in 11:23, this is the papal phase of the king of the north, who replaces the Seleucid Empire as the king of the north. And then this in the midst of the peace, I agree with Frank Hardy, that should belong to the previous verse. That also is relating to the papal phase of Rome in 825. See, that's pretty easy. You just compare the two, find similar language and similar ideas. Okay, then we find in 1131 a whole bunch of similar language, taking away that which is regular. There's no word for sacrifice here. It's regular worship of God by his people. And then you've got desolation, all this stuff. That language is in 811 to 13 in the context of the papal power. Okay, papal Rome phase of little horn. So again, we know where we are in verse 31. And then we have persecution by the papacy. We have reference to the indignation that are in both passages. Just continuing so far that's the papal Roman phase of the little horn power. Okay, and then in verse 40 of Daniel 11, it relates to 8:19. The vision refers to the appointed time of the end. And then in 8:25, it relates to 11:45. He comes to his end with none to help him. He shall be broken, but by no human hand. This is similar. It also relates to chapter 2. You remember the stone broke that is cut out with no human hand, right? So no human power conquers this one. God himself does that. All right, so those are the anchor points. Now, here's the summary of the intratextual anchor points. We have Persia, Greece, 4 Greek kingdoms. Then we have pagan Rome, where Christ is. That's imperial Rome. And then we have papal Rome in all of those other verses. So that's a pretty clear outline. And you see that both chapters have the same chronological flow in the basic overall outline. Now, verbal subjects and pronouns. We introduce in verse 5, I'm going to start there, because before that it's very clear. We start the king of the south in verse 5, and then one of his princes shall become stronger, and that becomes the king of the north. And then you've got the kings of the north and south here explicitly mentioned, and you go back and forth with he, and then king of the north or king of the south, and we know who is who because it says so. Then in verse 15, the king of the north shall come and throw up siege works and take a well-fortified cities, the forces of the south. Again, we have north and south. And then the next verse, verse 16, but he, that's referring to the king of the north. It's not some other power who comes against him. It's not referring to Rome here. Comes against him, the king of the south, shall do as he, king of the north, wills. None shall stand before him. He shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his hand. This is not Rome yet. We know that that is the case because in verse 17, we have that he that is the king of the north, shall give to him, the king of the south, the daughter of women to destroy the kingdom. Adventist interpreters have mistakenly interpreted this as Cleopatra the seventh is the daughter of women. That is incorrect. She was a Ptolemy. She was from the south. This is the king of the north, Antiochus III, giving his daughter Cleopatra the first to Ptolemy V, the king of the south. It doesn't work. The north-south identification doesn't work with Cleopatra VII. She's the Elizabeth Taylor Cleopatra. Okay, now you get what I'm talking about. Okay? And then in the next verse, verse 18, afterward he shall turn his face to the coastlands. This is Antiochus III that's still going up to the north to conquer up in Turkey and then across to Greece. A commander, that is a Roman commander, defeats him, Battle of Magnesia. He has to return. And then he goes back home and he's assassinated. This is all Antiochus III through verse 19. And this is affirmed by just the continuity of the pronouns. Verse 20. Then we have a major transition. These two verses, verses 20 and 21, are the major transitions. Then shall arise in his, that is the king of the north's place, one who shall send an exactor of tribute. Now, some translations say a tax collector. So everyone says, aha, that must be Augustus. Luke, he sends out a tax collector. The word is nogais, it means an oppressor. It cannot be Augustus because within a few days he shall be broken, neither in anger nor in battle. Augustus had a very long reign. It's not talking about Augustus here. It's most likely talking about Republican Rome with Pompey the Great, sent by the Republic out to gain control over Syria, Palestine, and everything, and gaining tribute. He's the oppressor. Next verse. In his place, that is in the place of what? In the place of Republican Rome stands up one who is a contemptible person, nivze, a despised person, to whom the royal majesty has not been given. And Uriah Smith went to great lengths to say that this is Tiberius and how awful he was. Look, he wasn't one of the most awful of the Roman kings. There were worse emperors than him by far. But he wants to have him be Tiberius because in the next verse, the Prince of the Covenant, which is Christ, dies under Tiberius. Verse 21 is not Tiberius because he was given the royal majesty. He was not a usurper. This is a usurper. I take that to be Julius Caesar, who usurped the Republican power, and then that went into the imperial Rome. Okay, verse then 23. From the time that an alliance is made with him, that is pagan Rome, the imperial Rome, he shall act deceitfully, shall become strong with a small people, and then he goes up. Here he rises, and so on. He becomes strong and rises. And this is really relating to the rise of the papacy, which takes off with a small group of Christian people, but then it threatens against Christ, the Prince of the Host, as we see in Daniel chapter 8. Then we have verse 25, the king of the north, which is the papacy, stirs up his power against the king of the south. Wait a minute, where's the king of the south? Ptolemies are long gone. Well, this chapter has geographic supersession, okay? Who took over the area of Egypt where Ptolemaic Empire was? When the Roman Empire broke up, that was taken over by Islamic power. And the nemesis, the great archenemy of the papacy, was Islamic power. The only power that existentially threatened the papacy, not once but twice, threatened to wipe out Christendom twice. So here you have the Crusades in verses 25 to 30, and then if that is the case, then the papacy, of course, is one of our anchor points. But if it's the going on to verse 40, at the time of the end, the king of the south. Who's the king of the south? Is this a new king of the south? Well, we've found geographic supersession. And furthermore, if this is the papacy, or if it's France, or if it's atheism, a king of the north is still a papacy here, because it's still the him in the previous verses. But if this here is if this here is atheism, or if it's France, since when did France or atheism decisively and permanently defeat Islam? See, you have to have succession by conquest in this chapter. And these powers have never defeated Islam. Islam, like the papacy, is still here. It has an address. It can be called a king in the sense that it's a church-state power. And the papacy is the same kind of power. These are the two great religious powers from the monotheistic religions, each of which is competing with each other, and God's people are caught in the middle. And I have plenty more here, but here's kings of the north and south showing supersession. And there you have who the kings are and the anchor points. And there's Islamic power, and we're done. Oh, 5 more minutes? Oh, I can have 5 more minutes. Oh, thank you. Wonderful. Okay, so here's a few exegetical points along the way, okay? So I've already demonstrated that Islam is the final power. By the way, I didn't hear, Tim Rosenberg mentioned that he first started to study about this in 2002. Did I get that right, Tim? 2002. Okay, I first heard this idea that the king of the north is the papacy and the king of the south is Islamic power in 1970. From my father, a church historian who was studying the Bible in preparation for a Daniel class at Union College. We were on vacation, and he was poring over Daniel 11, and he was muttering, no, this can't be Turkey here at the King of the North, and this has to be Islam, and that's where I first heard it. Well, later when I came to teach at the seminary, I had to teach Daniel, and I investigated for myself, found it's the only thing that could work. Then Randy Younker and I taught a interdisciplinary doctoral seminar, and he did the history and I did the text, and we came up with such a close match between history and text when the text is interpreted in this way. He'll talk a little bit more later. Okay, exegetical points. Your people. Who are your people? They are the Jewish people in 11 verse, I should have said 14, not 4. The violent ones among Daniel's own Jewish people. But later, we have very clearly, at the time of Michael standing up, then you have the resurrection. Who are God's people then? It's the New Testament makes it clear. It's all of the people who accept God. So that's who spiritual Israel is included in that. Another point, one view holds that the vision in Daniel 8 predicts Medo-Persia, then Greece, with division into the 4 Greek kingdoms, and then the papacy, going directly to the papacy. So that Daniel 11's interpretation must show the same structure, moving from the division into the 4 Greek kingdoms, verse 4, to the papacy already as the king of the north in verse 5, and then through the rest of the chapter. This is an extreme view, but several factors rule it out. It skips all the Seleucids and Ptolemies and pagan Rome. In Daniel 11, verse 4, it's divided to the 4 winds or directions, as I pointed out. One of them is the king of the south, then the king of the north. So you have the continuity. This simply expands on division of the Greek Empire. Pagan Rome is represented both in 8:9 and 11:20 to 22, including the death of Christ. This is not during the period of the papacy. It's before that in pagan Rome. Therefore, you can't skip to the papacy already by verse 5. Okay, 2 minutes, okay. Daniel 11, verse 14. Many shall rise against the king of the south, the sons of the violent ones among your people. Some interpret this, the robbers of your people, like KJV, and that's supposed to be Rome. However, paritz means violent one, and in Isaiah 35:9, a paritz of the animals is a violent one of the animals, belonging to the animals. It's not a violent one against the animals. So it's not the violent ones, the robbers against your people, it's the violent ones among. It's Jewish people. And besides, they're trying to establish the vision. That's what Jewish people would do, not Romans. And they would do that. Okay, I think we'll quit there. Oh, just this one more thing. 11:24, only for a time. This is not 360 years. You can't assume day-year principle everywhere. Hebrew uses moed in Daniel 12 for 3.5 times. And ad 8, the word 8, it appears literally in another passage. There's no reason in context for day year. There's no indication of a number with 8 or answering a question. And so I have several more, but I'm going to quit there. And you can look at the PowerPoint. It'll be up on the website later, and you can read my paper.
Okay. Thank you, Brother Roy. That is Daniel11prophecy.com. There are many, many excellent papers placed there. Now we have a father-son team of Michael and Randy Younker as they present on another component of this perspective.
Enjoyed being here and hearing all the different presentations, and I find a lot of common ground, which is important. The fact that we share a high view of Scripture is critically important. We believe that Daniel was indeed a 6th century prophet, not a 2nd century, pseudo-prophet where somebody wrote it after the events. We seriously take the role of the spirit of prophecy in helping us understand. Now, I just gave Roy extra 5 minutes because since my work is based on his exegetical work, I wanted to hear what he had to say and get the kind of complete picture. Now, I have to give you a very quick presentation of one historical thing that I looked at, and frankly, I could talk for 2 hours on this, and I've got about 15 minutes, so I'm not going to be able to give you all the supporting data. But I will tell you a little bit of a story of how I came across this. I used to teach the atheistic kind of symbolic view, but I was like Roy, always bothered with the fact that I couldn't find the exegetical support for the transition to that. I mean, people kind of jump around, but I was never satisfied from an intellectual, scholarly point of view. I've always had the attitude that I want to be able to share this with my non-Adventist scholars and find it compelling for them. Most of the approaches we take, I just could not convince them. They just kind of looked at me like, big eyes and walk away. And so I started looking at the historical application a little bit more seriously, and I focused on a unique word that most people kind of gloss over, Kedem, in Daniel 11:30. And so I'm just going to give you a quick view of what I found there. I actually worked on the island of Cyprus, which is traditionally understood to be Kitim, and I could give a whole lecture on why that is. I don't have time. Is this how I change the pictures here? Okay, which of these pretty buttons? That wasn't that pretty button. Big green button. I should have seen that. Okay. And here's where I ran into a little bit of a problem. I've been working in the Mediterranean the last 10 years in Cyprus and Sicily, as well as my previous work over in Palestine, Israel, and Jordan. And as I read Uriah Smith's chronology, it posed a bit of a problem for me. I couldn't share this with my colleagues because they wouldn't buy it. Uriah wanted to move the forward chronological flow of Daniel 11 up through verse 22, the breaking of the Prince of the Covenant in 31 AD. Then he wants to go backwards in verse 23 to about 161 BC, and he talks about the alliance between the Jews and the Romans, with the Romans being the small people. I had a problem with that because it didn't really comport with what I understood the Romans to be. Now, I don't have all my slides here, but basically by 161, Rome was not a small people at all. They had just won the Second Punic War. They had beat Hannibal and the Carthaginians. You can see the red line going there to where Carthage is from Cyprus and Palestine. And Uriah Smith basically, I got to stay on my focus here. The Romans had also beaten Antiochus the Great between the area of Greece and Anatolia. There was a major battle there. And so by the time of 161, the Romans were so powerful that when Antiochus Epiphanes comes down to Egypt on the right side of your screen there with the idea that the Seleucids are going to take over the Ptolemaic kingdom, all the Romans have to do is send an ambassador down there. And I think I might have the picture here. Let's see if I have all this. This is the war of the Second Punic War there. In 168, the Romans demanded Antiochus IV leave Egypt and return to Syria. And there's a famous story of how Popilius Linus comes up. He's the Roman ambassador on the right, and he tells Antiochus Epiphanes, the Roman people want you to go back to Syria, and you're not to conquer Egypt, the Ptolemaic kingdom there. And Antiochus basically says, well, let me think about it. And the Roman ambassador says, sure, take all the time you want. And then he draws a circle around Antiochus' feet and says, but I'll have your answer before you step out of that circle. Antiochus only thought about it for a few more seconds, and he said, we'll leave. And he took his huge army all the way back to Syria. So that was one Roman ambassador against Antiochus and a large army, and they retreat just by the word of the Romans. So Uriah Smith's historical context for me just doesn't work, and I know I couldn't convince any of my other Roman archaeologists that this is the situation. They'd say, what are you talking about? It doesn't make any sense. So that made me look at the rest of Uriah Smith's reconstruction of Daniel 11, because if you move the chronology in verse 23 back before Christ dying in 31, 160, to 161 BC, that throws the rest of the chronology off for the rest of Daniel, at least for me as a historian. And so I started trying to match things up in Uriah Smith's reconstruction, and he was well intended. This is not a diatribe against Uriah Smith. I'm a big fan. His book, Daniel and Revelation, is a very important book. I'm happy to have a copy in my library. I've read it. And it's a very important work for Adventist history. But chapter 11 is full of little problems for me historically. The rest of the work's pretty solid, but that's a problem. And when he got to Kitim, what he did, and let's see if I can get this going here. Does this go backwards too? The red one. That's what happens when you don't check out your equipment ahead of time. Well, you saw a map there. Uriah Smith wanted to make Kitim the land or the city of Carthage. And that doesn't work either, because if you do studies, and there's a lot of new studies on this very topic. I worked in Cyprus. A lot of Cypriot archaeologists and historians have been looking at this very issue. It's material that's been published, but I don't know of too many Adventists reading it. But if you do a careful study of Numbers 24:24, Isaiah 23, Ezekiel 27, Jeremiah 2, all of these mention the word Kitim. And it's pretty well decided that Kitim does mean only Cyprus. It cannot mean Carthage. It cannot mean any other place in the Mediterranean Sea. How did we come up with the idea, and Uriah Smith actually quotes this, how did we come up with the idea that Kitim could maybe mean Carthage or Greece or Rome? Well, the idea is actually pretty simple if you know a little bit about the history. what happened was, between 168 BC and 31 AD, the Jewish community was really worried existentially about their survival. They were being attacked by the Seleucid Greeks, and they started writing a special genre of literature that scholars call apocryphal apocalyptic literature. What the Jews were doing was they were taking books like Daniel and other prophetic books, and they were trying to rework those books by writing pseudo-inspired works to explain what was going on. And since they were looking down the throat of the Greeks, the Seleucids, they concluded that Kedem must mean Greece, either the Seleucid Greeks or Alexander the Great and the Macedonian Greeks. And this is in their literature. You can read it. And so they were convinced of this, and they started circulating this around the Jewish community in Israel as they were facing this crisis. A little bit later, by 63 BC, of course, the Romans come on the scene. Initially, the Romans are seen as friends to the Jews because the Romans kicked the Greeks out. And so some Jews said maybe the Romans are Kedem. And they were very happy that the Romans were helping them get rid of the Greeks. But, as we all know, historically, the Romans started becoming enemy of the Jews. And pretty soon, their apocalyptic literature started painting Rome differently. And they started calling them bad guys. The Kedem were bad guys now. Originally they were good guys, but now they're bad guys. But they were convinced that Kedem was Rome. And so even in the translation of the Old Greek LXX, the Septuagint, they actually changed the word Kedem to the Greek word for Rome. They were so convinced that they shouldn't have done that, but they did. And that prevailed all the way until about 31 AD. The latter part of the Jewish apocryphal literature was written by the Qumran community, and they were convinced there would be a final battle between the Jews, the sons of light, and the sons of darkness, which many of them thought were the Romans. Unfortunately, when that final battle came, we know about the war in 71 AD and 69, 68, 69, all the way to 73 when Masada finally fell. The Jews lost that war. But they still thought they could beat the Romans eventually. And there was a second revolt called the Bar Kokhba revolt in 131. The Jews tried again to overthrow them, confident from their prophecies based on Daniel and Daniel 11 that they would beat the Romans. But they didn't. They were totally wiped out, and the Romans basically kicked them completely out of Jerusalem and hauled a lot of them out of Israel, took them away as slaves, and that was pretty much the end of the Jewish obsession with apocryphal apocalyptic. They had failed so many times they quit writing it. Okay, that's the end of it. Then for the next couple of centuries, the Christians weren't quite sure how to relate to this, but some Christians like Jerome said, look, maybe that's not a literal fulfillment, the time of Antiochus Epiphanes and Kedem, but maybe it symbolically represents Rome. But we're still looking for a future fulfillment of Kedem with the Antichrist. And so the Christians started turning to a new perspective on Daniel 11. It just so happens that by the 4th century AD, and I need to come to the conclusion of my story here, I got 5 minutes. It's a pity because the best part's going to be left out perhaps. But they started the Christians started writing their own apocalyptic, apocryphal literature based on Daniel. And they actually introduced a new work called Daniel on the island of Cyprus at the end of the 4th century. And they were interpreting maybe peoples from the north fulfilling this prophecy, not the Romans anymore. That kind of lasted for a couple hundred years until the 7th century, when suddenly Islam arose. Guess what the Christians started doing? They started writing more apocryphal, apocalyptic literature, and they actually started identifying Islam as the Antichrist, and they put it into the Kedem War. Okay? Now we have to jump in, and this is where my conclusion is going to be. We jump up, what's that? You're going to give me just a couple extra minutes, okay? We can actually follow the apocalyptic literature the Christians are writing, apocryphal apocalyptic literature based on Daniel, and we can trace it for many centuries until you get up to the 14th century. They were convinced something was still going to happen at Kedem, and they knew it was no longer Western lands. The Jews actually had put that in because of Greece and Rome, but the Christians realized that was false, and they changed the LXX back to say Kedem, Cyprus. They knew that this was Cyprus, not Western lands. Historical critics would later play upon that, and unfortunately that got into Adventist literature too. And so our interpretations, including Uriah Smith, was accidentally influenced by a misinterpretation of Kedem that's advocated by historical critics who believe in the Antiochus Epiphanes theory that the book was written in the 2nd century by a pseudo-Daniel. So we'll set that aside. In the 14th century, the Christians were all convinced that Kedem was really the land of Cyprus, the island of Cyprus. And at that time, both Muslims and Christians started writing additional apocryphal, apocalyptic, Danielic literature. Both sides were saying that the next to last, not the last, because they knew about Daniel 11:40, but the next to last battle, which is Daniel 11:30, would happen on Cyprus. In the decades of the 16th century, running up to what became known as the War of Cyprus, both sides were cranking out literature. They were saying the other side was the Antichrist, and that ultimately the winner of this would set up the final battle in 1140 that would bring about the end of the world. As we get into the 1540s, the 1550s, 1560s, this literature is proliferating both in the Christian world and in the Islamic world. It's an amazing thing. Most scholars aren't aware of this, except for a small number working on this material. Finally, the war came. The war started in 1570. The Christians were determined to put a stop to this war, and the Pope desperately, Pope Pius V, tried to get an alliance to stop it happened to be the Ottoman Turks, to stop them from getting Cyprus, but it didn't work. The Turks put together one of the largest navies of their time, over 400 ships, and they invaded Cyprus from Egypt and from Constantinople, which was by that time Istanbul, and from other ports in the eastern Levant. And they invaded Cyprus. They took the island over. They slaughtered the Christians. They actually peeled the skin off of many of the Christians in one of the cities on the east coast after promising them free passage. That, of course, got the Christian part of the Mediterranean very upset, and Pius V was finally to make the Holy Roman Alliance. They put together in a few months the biggest navy ever seen by Christianity. It was over 250 warships. That's a special word. The ships of Kedem is actually a special type of a war galley with oars and sails. And they sailed off to recapture Cyprus. The Turks knew they were coming. They put together 250 ships of their own, and they rushed to the northwest to stop the Christians from coming down. And they met at the Battle of Lepanto, which is between Greece and Italy. It was actually a Muslim port. It was the biggest naval battle in ancient history and in the top 10 naval battles of all time. It was not just a little side affair. It was a big thing. The amazing thing was the Christians actually won that battle. It was the second part of the War of Cyprus. They wiped out the fleet. 2 more minutes. They wiped out the fleet of the Turks, and the sailors rushed back. They told the Pope, we won, and they weren't expecting that. The Pope commissioned a big painting to be made of the Battle of Lepanto, and he urged the admirals, turn around, we want you to go to Jerusalem, take the Holy Land, take Egypt, take all the Islamic world. But unfortunately, the admirals started bickering among themselves, and they were a little scared to go back. They were shocked that they won, and they refused to go. Within 2 years, they surrendered to the Turks, and they paid the Turks a big fine. They let the Turks keep Cyprus, and they let them keep the entire eastern Mediterranean. They still were expecting the final battle to come, though. That's predicted in 1140. That was supposed to happen in the 1600s. That date came, but the end didn't come. So now the question I have is, how does this apply? Were these guys completely wrong in seeing Cyprus? From my own perspective, if Kedem is Cyprus, and if we take a literal viewpoint, then we have to actually factor this into our prophecies. And that is one of the reasons I've been more open to looking at the Islamic thing. The Crusades clearly was a battle between the Christian West and the Muslim East. I would say North and South, but I have to explain that. The second battle was between the Christian Holy Roman Empire and the Muslim Ottomans in this case. If we have the same continuity of the King of the North for the first half of those post-Christ being crucified battles, there's one more battle to come, and that's the one that's mentioned in verse 40. Okay? That's just a little picture of some of the research we've been working on. Thank you.
All right, Dr. Younker, why don't you stay here? Dr. Gane, why don't you come on up? And we're going to give 5 minutes to any of the presenters that have been in our series to come and ask questions or make comments. So, and of course, Michael has been a key part of researching all of this, so you may want to be involved in that. So, Mark, you're going to ask a question or make a comment?
I love history. You guys, our hearts beat in the same chest on this. Just one question, Dr. Gane, and I love the exegesis, and I look forward to getting your PowerPoints because I'm very interested in the personal pronouns and how they traverse through the chapter. You mentioned geographic succession for the king of the south. Egypt being Islamic, therefore the king of the south is Islam. Is that correct?
Yes, the geographic succession is clearly indicated in the chapter. Earlier you have, there shall stand in his place. And that means the conquering power then takes over. Just like, for example, Greece conquered Persia, and then that takes over, and then in his place now pagan Rome takes over, then the next phase of Rome,
Sure.
and so on and so forth. And so then the Rome, of course, during the period of the Roman Empire, they had already taken Egypt. But Egypt is not called the king of the north because you don't say in his place. You don't have that indication. But then when the Roman Empire splits, then you get the southern part of the Roman Empire, and you do have a north-south, and you do have a conflict that's very serious.
Sure.
Yeah.
I guess I'm just trying to understand the papacy being the king of the north. You suggest that too at the end of Daniel 11.
That's right. Well, the papacy, of course, we have, you could say it's a leader. We have antitypical, we have
Sure.
Babylon in Revelation, which would be the papacy and the other powers. So I would see that going together.
Yeah, and I guess I'm looking at geography. In my way of thinking, if you're geographically focused on the south, you have to do the same for the north. And I'm wondering how you would harmonize that. And that's my only question.
Yeah, okay. Well, the Christendom, what is the territory of the that power? In geographical succession, that papacy, that church-state union, has taken over that whole area. So you have the center of gravity shifts, obviously. Now, when we talk about the king of the south, some people say, well, that's just Egypt. It's not just Egypt, because you have another, it says that when the king of the north comes, he passes through countries, plural, and you have a number of them mentioned, not just Egypt, but Libya. And then I didn't get to one slide, which is about Moab, Ammon, and Edom, right? And that's not symbolic, that's just archaic language. How did they have to say, another way to say that the people belonging to that territory? It's archaic. Just like the weapons are archaic in verse 40. Ships and, chariots, horses and chariots. We don't have that. We don't use cavalry anymore. But it's just archaic language. How else was Daniel going to say it? Yeah. Did that answer the question?
I guess to me, if you're looking at the geographic south of Israel as a symbol of Islam, you would have to do the same for the king of the north. And if the papacy is west and doesn't really control that region currently, it would just seem inconsistent.
Right. Okay. Dr. Younker is going to answer that.
Well, I'm not sure I'll answer it satisfactorily, but one of the things that impressed my historical studies, when you have the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, the reference point for north and south is Jerusalem. Okay? And almost everybody in the ancient times, if you're Babylon, Assyria, Greece, or Rome, you came across over to just south of Turkey to the area of Antioch, and you drop straight south towards Jerusalem. If you're in the south, around Egypt, or anywhere else, to Africa or Saudi Arabia, or wherever, you came up through Egypt, crossed the Canal of Egypt, and then you went north. So in a more restricted way, the kings of the north and south were geographically properly located. Now, when Islam and the papacy come along, if you look at a map from the Middle Ages, basically Christendom is the entire north of the Mediterranean. Islam's the entire south of the Mediterranean. And so there's still there's what you call succession, but it's also expansion. That's right. And so both of these areas, from their core areas, from Syria and Egypt, expand to the west, to the east, and to the south on both sides. And so if you look at a map, it's still very north and south. And even today, to a certain extent, you still have that same orientation. So there's kind of two phases: the early phase, north and south, then the expansive succession phase.
Okay, I wanted to give Michael just a chance to say a word or two before we sit down.
This is just a quick opportunity. Obviously, I appreciate Dr. Gane and my dad, and so I ceded my time to them, but they want to give me 2 minutes, and what I wanted to cover was what they didn't cover, and that was a little bit more detailed history concerning verses 24 to verse 30. And so I'm just going to make a couple of comments. I don't have any slides here now prepared for you, but I just wanted to let you know that we have thought about them, because they didn't talk about it, but we have thought about it, and I just wanted to comment on that. For this audience here, I think some of it was mentioned yesterday. In verse 24, we see that something is done by this new king of the north that their fathers have never done. I think Roy did mention that this is probably a reference to the people of God, because in Daniel 9:6 and many other places in Daniel 9, what their fathers have never done is a reference to God's people. So we do see additional support here for the papacy. Now, what they do that they have never done before is they scatter among them the prey, the spoil, the riches. He shall forecast his devices against the strongholds even for a time. What we see here is the rise of the feudal system. If you understand how the papacy gained power over what became known as Christendom, it was through the feudal system, which was basically a dividing and conquering principle, where every little tiny castle is its own little kingdom, and they all kind of make alliances under princes and kings and so forth. This feudal system reigned from basically the breakup of the Roman Empire all the way until 1798. And so we have a very long period in which this is the primary method of how Rome controls the princes and the kings and the various other entities. So this is what they're doing. They're forecasting devices against strongholds for a time. In verse 25, we do see, of course, the Crusades, and I don't have time to share a full presentation on how I see this playing out, but I just want you to know that we have actually been working on identifying exactly how this describes what happened there and what figures are involved. When it says, for example, in verse 26, I think they have another one. It talks about these two kings shall basically make treaties with each other, shall sit at one table, but they'll be deceitful. We see this as probably reflecting the king of the north and the king of the south, and the activities of the Roman, the papacy, and the Roman kings and emperors. And so when it says of the king of the north that those who sit at his table and eat his choice foods, this is a reference to Daniel chapter 1. Daniel's eating the choice foods, or invited to eat the choice foods of the king, but he rejects to do so. Well, in this case, who eats at the choice foods of the papacy? That would be the Roman emperors in particular. And if you want to look for a particular name of one who would do this, that would be the famous Emperor Frederick II, who actually was the adopted ward of the Pope and ended up having a lot of power. Moving very quickly, in one final minute, when we come to verse 29, there's a very critical Hebrew phrase that helps fill in the gaps of why we see continuity between 25 to 28, 29 and 30, and then 40 to 45. If you happen to have your King James Bible, you will see a little bit of the Hebrew preserved, and it says, "And this time it will not be as it was before, Rishon, or as it will be afterwards, Acharon." And throughout the Hebrew Bible, Rishon and Acharon are often paired as the first and the last, etc., etc. They're used in describing something earlier and something later, or first and last. And this one in the middle, Kedem, or the War of Cyprus, is not going to be like the First Crusades or the last pair of battle between apparently the same kings. And so we see continuity between the whole sequence, and I'll just rest it there.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, gentlemen. We're going to take a 5-minute break. We'll be back at 5:05. We have 3 more presentations, and then we do have a light supper for everyone at 6. So if you want to ask them questions during the break, you can kind of see where they're seated.